of Filipino without understanding what was happening in other Spanish colonies, beginning in the early 19th century. First, you have the separation of Mexico, Nova España from Madre España. This was very important and big shock to us in the Philippines because actually Spain was ruling the Philippines via Mexico for a long time. There was a big logistical reason to that. Walang Suez Canal non. So the routes to the Philippines were very very difficult. You have to either circumnavigate all the way, go through, around Africa, and then go to Asia, Vasco da Gama, or you go the Magellan way, right? So a lot of Espanol, much easier for them to go to Latin America or South America, right? All they have to do is just cross lang yung the Atlantic Ocean, no? Before going to the Philippines, ang layo-layo na yan, no? So for a long time, actually, we were ruled via Mexico because from Mexico to the Philippines is just the Pacific. And this is what's very important. Actually, ang Pilipinas ang arguably the beginning of globalization. Literally, the whole globe was connected when the galleon trade started. The galleon trade was essentially bringing products and resources from Latin America, Mexico, Philippines, China, and Asia, right? That was the first time in the entire human history na na-connect natin lahat ng continents. So parating pinag-usapan ng mga Chino, etc. is that ang globalization started with so-called Silk Road and so on and so forth. Very Sinocentric views of that, which I have some serious problems with. As if China was the center of the universe. No, neither the West nor China was center. There were multiple centers of civilizations during that time. In fact, the cradle of civilization was in the Middle East and West Asia. But ibang usapan na yan. But actually, the first time all continents were connected in a major global trade, yun yung galleon trade. And the Philippines was very much at the center of that. So if you look at the beauty of vegan, for instance, right, and some of the old, Spanish quarters in northern Philippines, among others, is because those cities were central to the global trade, right? And alam din natin, maraming merchants from China and other regions also come to the Philippines because of this galleon trade, right? So that's very very important. In fact, I think the term sangli, if I'm not mistaken, means tradesman or something like that, right? Which was a term used for folks of Chinese background or ancestry. Now, if you look at it, in the Philippines, there was a parallel process actually happening. So while you had Simon Bolivar in the case of Latin America, and earlier, of course, in the case of Mexico, in the case of Philippines also, we had our versions or people similar to him, but not initially, or at least not logistically and militarily as successful as Simon Bolivar. Now, there are many radical differences between the case in the Philippines and those countries. Medyo mahabang usapan na yan. But we had people similar to that. So, for instance, si El Conde Filipino, no? So by 1820s and 1830s already, you had cases of people who identified as Filipino. So this Luis Rodriguez Varela, who is known as El Conde Filipino. Ito yung isang tao na nag-aaral sa Pransa. You can consider him as one of the first ilustrados. So Filipino in a sense, from the Philippines, studied in Europe, studied in France in particular, and particularly na exposed siya dun sa ideas of French Revolution. Now this is very important because arguably the introduction of Philippines to liberal ideas started with the Cadiz Constitution, right? So kung maalala nyo, there was a person called Napoleon, right? And then this person called Napoleon actually conquered Spain. And when he conquered Spain, Napoleonic revolutionary republican ideals were superimposed on Spain. So Spain had the Cadiz Constitution of 1812. Under the Cadiz Constitution of 1812, liberal ideas were introduced not only to Spain but also to colonies. And more importantly, there was a degree of introduction of autonomy and some sort of respect and dignity to people from the colonies, including from the Philippines. So may mga representatives ng Pilipinas doon sa parlamento, doon sa Espanya, sa Madrid. Now, this didn't last long because eventually natalo si Napoleon, na-restore yung monarchy, nagkaroon ng trapuhan, but actually the genie was already out of the bottle. So by the 1820s and 1830s, there were already people from the Philippines, not necessarily Filipino looking, but from the Philippines, purely Spanish-blooded, a lot of them European-educated, who wanted already a certain degree of Republican liberal politics in the Philippines. So this is fully half a century before sila Rizal and all come into the picture, right? Come into the picture. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind, right? And then later on, We can go on and on talk about a lot of different other key figures in the Philippines. But simultaneously, and this is what I like about dun sa movie ng Gombursa, it also mentions that while may mga Espanyol na born in the Philippines who consider themselves as Filipino, already were having tensions with their fellow Espanyol who were not treating them as equal kasi hindi sila pinanganak dun sa Madre España. There were also mga Filipino, quote-unquote, I don't know, Indio or whatever, who were also pushing for greater and greater recognition, right, of their humanity and also their fidelity to the message of the Lord. And again, sorry, spoiler alert, but one of the beauty of the Gomburza movie is that it emphasizes, for instance, the contribution. I mean, I was hoping outside of Gomburza also talk about Varela, but Gomburza talks about this very important figure, say Hermano Pule. I hope that's a correct way of pronouncing the name. So if you look at it, he was a religious figure, right? He was a religious figure who found yung Confradia de San Jose, right? Confraternity of Saint Joseph. So ito yung na-establish in 1832 in response dun sa mga racially discriminatory practices ng the clerical hierarchy in the Philippines, no? Dahil kung hindi ka Espanyol, hindi ka galing sa Espanya, parang hindi ka na-recognize as, as a essentially full-fledged human being for that matter. Not to mention, definitely, there will be a pushback if you wanna, preach the message of the Lord in circumvention of the authority of the Spanish-blooded Europeo clerical authority in the Philippines. So this is one of the things I like about the movie. In fact, sorry, spoiler alert, ito yung kwento. Ito yung essential opening scene sa movie, no? Padre Palaez talking about the case of Hermano Pule. Now, which brings me to the next issue. Sorry, I don't want to do too many spoiler. So kanina I showed to you guys mga Creoles, also Varela, right? In fairness, there were also quote-unquote Indio Filipinos, indigenous Filipinos who were also pushing for greater and greater equality and recognition of their humanity and also their right to preach, and developing indigenous religious movements. But this is where things are interesting, and we see a lot of parallels between what's happening in the Philippines at saka yung nangyari dyan sa mga iba't ibang bansa sa Latin America and Mexico. So interestingly, actually, dun sa first part of the movie, right, it's really it really zeroes in on yung kwento ni Father Pedro Palaez, no? Pedro Palaez y Sebastian, right? So kung titingnan mo siya, so he was a diocesan administrator of the Archdiocese of Manila, no? Well, a tragedy happened, so that's why perhaps we don't know him as much. But probably if the tragedy didn't happen, we would have known far more about Palaez because he already had very strong ideas about growing equality, right? Between yung mga pinanganak sa Pilipinas at saka yung mga galing sa Madre España. Now, kitang-kita sa itsura niya, this person looks far more Spanish than quote-unquote Asian or Filipino. But these people were at the very forefront of pushing for what will eventually become a Philippine Revolution, right? So napakalaking influence ni Padre Palaez because Padre Palaez was the mentor of Jose Burgos, right? And if you look at Jose Burgos, again, you're looking at the Creole, right? So these people are Creoles. They were the first Filipinos and they're Creoles, right? You can clearly see. So the first Filipinos were people, a lot of them were people with Spanish blood or European blood, who were resenting itong mistreatment na nakakuha nila from their fellow Espanols or pure blood Espanols, whatever, who didn't treat them as equals or fully humans for that matter, right? So in the movie, sinasabi dito na actually ang away dito is between friars and then yung mga secular na priests, etc. So essentially semi-legalistic, secular administrators, etc. But fundamentally, ito yung klarong-klaro na lumalabas sa pelikula is that this is also about racial politics and racial equality. Spanish blood people born in the Philippines or partly Spanish people born in the Philippines not feeling that they're being treated as equal human beings, etc. That there's clearly a discriminatory caste system in charge here. So this is very clear. Now, And this is where I want to go really dito sa libro ni Joaquin, because I know, because for me, I got to appreciate how important Jose Burgos was after reading ni Joaquin. I mean, I've read about him in other works, but this is where very much I appreciate it. So please, let me just be patient with me and let me read this part. So it says, to call Jose Burgos the precursor of Rizal is therefore questionable. Parang insulto daw yan. Principally because it seems to place Burgos outside or before the mainstream of our history, when actually, ito yung sinasabi ni Joaquin, he is a, quote, central figure to it, standing between the Criolla insurgency that generated nationalist consciousness, yung mga minensyon ka kanina, El Conde Filipino, etc., and also the counterparts in Mexico and South America, which were very successful, Simon Bolivar, principally, and the revolution that was a result of that consciousness, meaning yung kilala natin, revolution natin, that will eventually reach its apogee in 1898. If Burgos is linked to the first through the figures of Gomez and Palaez, he's linked to the second through such disciples of his as Pasiano Rizal, Ambrosio Rianzares, and Marcelo H. del Pilar. The Katipunan explicitly recognized the continuity by enshrining Gomburza and turning the Criolles' prime fighting words, Hijos del País, into its own militant anak ng bayan. Alright, so this is very important. So if you actually read the book, A Question of Heroes, ang contention ni Joaquin, which I completely agree, is that pinaka-first niya nilagay si Jose Burgos. Jose Burgos comes first. Now, my contention, of course, to be a little bit more historical accurate, is I'll even start with El Conde Filipino, Varela, and I'll also bring Hermano Pule and all of that. But in a way, this was, in a way, to say nagsimula lang ito with sila Rizal or Bonifacio, it's a very questionable claim. It's an insult to the great legacy of these people. Now, interesting, of course, alam natin na none of these folks, these Criolla Filipinos, wanted total separation from España or the kind of full-blown revolution na makita natin by 1898 and towards the end of 19th century. But yung ideas nila were very important in forming the foundations what will be a full-blown revolution by the end of the century, right? This is a very important thing to keep in mind, mga kameta. Now, second thing, and this is very important part, no? At ito makikita natin sa pelikula na yan. Now, on a side note, some people said that they really appreciated yung casting ni Pepe Burgos because yung mga actors ay medyo kamukha daw. Now, I'm not sure how much, I mean, syempre pogi naman si ano, pangalan niya, ano pa, Mike, ito naman tayo sa mga artista naman. No, what's his name? Oh my God, I'm Piolo Pascual, right? Piolo Pascual, my God, I'm horrible. Like, yeah, I think Piolo Pascual played the role very well of Pedro Palaez, but you know what I'm saying? Like, Pedro Palaez, the real one, would look very much like your typical Europeo or Spanish, right? Now, for the casting of the Jose Burgos, again, as you can see in many pictures, the real Jose Burgos would have looked much more European or Eurasian for that matter. But there's one picture I found of Padre Burgos that, in fairness, medyo malapit dun sa kinuhang actor na, of course, nanalo ng Best Actor last year, no? Ito yung picture na nakita ko na medyo similar lang. But as I said, if you really look at the, you know, most of the pictures, both Palaez and Burgos would look very much Eurasian, right? So here, di ba? Sobrang similar itsura. This is where I feel na, in fairness, the casting was perfect and all, right? But I think if you look at the most of the pictures, really Padre Burgos comes as your typical, typical Creole, right? Not too different from how Simon Bolivar or other Creole revolutionaries in South America and Mexico would look like, and definitely with Padre Palaez, right? So this is a very important thing to keep in mind. So in short, being Filipino was never a racially specific thing. Hindi siya, it's not about being Moreno, it's not about being Matangos, it's not being about Asian or brown or yellow or white. It was really cosmopolitan from the very beginning. So I talked about Hermano Pule, I talked about Valera, I'm talking about now Palaez, I'm talking about now Jose Burgos. You look at it, very diverse, racially diverse. And that's what makes the Philippines very unique and special in Asia, right? You cannot find any other Asian country with this kind of diverse background, and at the same time, as early as 19th century, 1820s, 30s pa lang, meron na tayong embers of modern Republican, French-style, almost revolutionary upheavals in the Philippines, right? Or at least people who wanted to push for those kind of revolutions. So this is very important thing to keep in mind, all right? Now, one of the beauties also in that movie is that you'll also see yung exposure nila Pasiano, yung kapatid ni Rizal, and also other kind of key, Buen Camino among others, will also become key figures all the way to the Philippine-American War. And of course, yung mga iba sa atin na nanonood ng ano yung pelikula ni, ano pangalan niya? Pelikula ni General Luna, they would know what I'm talking about. I think Buen Camino and all will be also mentioned there quite prominently. But anyway, now let's go to the second part, and this is very important part. Now, there's a part there where it looks at again, sorry for the spoilers, but the second thing I want to talk about in this movie is, again, now sa aking universidad, sa aking alma mater, again, there's this whole school of thought that questions Rizal as a true revolutionary, right? Now, first of all, that's completely ignoramus, because if you really read what you're supposed to read. So, for instance, the Schumacher, who's used as one of the leading sources, including for this movie, about understanding Philippine Revolution, may letter from Schumacher to Rizal whereby they discuss revolution. And the advice of Schumacher is that don't push for a revolution unless you're sure that this revolution has a good chance of succeeding. Otherwise, mamamatay lang mga tao in vain. And that's reckless and irresponsible. Right? Yun ang problema natin. Hindi pwede bara-bara pagdating sa revolution. So you have to look at certain preconditions. And one of the preconditions is that the imperial power, Madre España in this case, should be imperially overstretched, meaning involving many conflicts and all that cannot effectively respond to a revolutionary upheaval in one of its colonies, i.e. the Philippines. Now, for some reason, because siguro nasa dapitan si Rizal, medyo isolated siya, and perhaps hindi siya kasang updated dun sa grabe ng giyera, yung lalim ng giyera sa Cuba, which forced Spain to deploy more than 100,000 troops across the Atlantic. It was a very difficult military operations. Now, Bonifacio, not being dapitan, being here in Manila, right, and being pretty well informed, and I think knowing a little bit of English among others, he knew actually what was happening. He knew how weak España was, and that's why he decided to strike at España. Except, you also need certain military skills and organizations to make that work, and that's why eventually sila Aguinaldo and the Cavite people will be able to be more successfully pushing against the Espanyol. And then the rest is history, right? We can talk about that. Now, one of the important scenes dito sa pelikula na yan is this scene whereby there's this conversation between Governor de la Torre and Jose Burgos. So Jose Burgos is assuming na De La Torre is a liberal, therefore progressive, na makikinig siya sa kanya, na eto yung mga estudyante niya, sila Pasiano, Ben Camino, na pwede ma-expel dahil sa mga kanilang insurrectionary activities. Things will go fine in their favor. But that conversation is very revealing. So that's one of the parts of the movie that I really love, because in that part of the movie, makikita mo na even the supposed best version of Spanish Imperium, meaning a liberal, semi-progressive Governor General like De La Torre comes in and says, know your place. Dapat alam mo yung lugar mo. In short, you're not equal to us. And then mag-insist dyan si Jose Burgos na, hindi ito radical. I'm not asking for anything revolutionary. I'm just asking for recognition of equality. No, na hindi pwede yung mga galing lang sa Espanya friars, they will just mistreat us that way and take away whatever we have worked on. Hindi pwede ganyan. And he's again reminded by this liberal Governor General, know your place. Meaning, your basic idea of equality is considered as insurrectionary, right? And in a way, a heresy, an act of treason. So dito makikita natin na liberalismo was already seen as something revolutionary by the Spanish. And therefore, to be liberal was to be revolutionary at this point in time. So yung mga nagsasabi na si Rizal ay liberal, we're not talking about yung liberal party at yung mga ek-ek ngayon. Hindi ko pinag-usapan yung mga yan. I'm talking about, alright, I'm talking about asking for basic things, right of representation, recognition of your basic dignity as a human being, certain degree of freedom of expression and assembly, right? Equality, basic legal equality, right? Recognition of equality and humanity. Yan po ay ngayon kinoconsider natin as standard liberal ideals. But during that time, these were considered as radical. In fact, that's the term that De La Torre uses during his conversations with Jose Burgos. Radical. You cannot be radical. Hindi yan. Bawal yan. Right? And Jose Burgos said, no. All we want is equalidad. That's all we're asking for. Is that too much? That's radical. Right? And that comes from De La Torre. And then things go very bad because once De La Torre leaves, he's replaced by someone who more accurately represents etong brutality of the Spanish imperial machine, right? The Spanish imperial machine by the late 19th century was both pathetic and brutal. It was pathetic because it was already a shadow of its past. It was a shell of its former glorious self. It had lost already like 80-90% of its colonies and was just left with Cuba, essentially in the Philippines and the Spanish East Indies in this part of the world. It was weak, it was backward. In fact, kung titingnan mo yung mga sinulat ni Rizal ukol sa Espanya, and then when Rizal went to Paris, when Rizal went to Germany, to Belgium, he realized, and Germany especially, he realized, and London, he realized how backward Spain was compared to these other places. So Spain was a poor, backward, paranoid, weak, arrogant, denial mode kind of superpower. Pwede pa silent. So Spain at this point was a paranoid, backward, and increasingly brutal, collapsing empire essentially, right? And it was so scared because America was rising and nipping, gnawing at its final colonies there like Cuba, and then you have the rise of Germany, and then New Britain and France, the global empires. So sobrang pathetic ng Espanya by this time, diba? So even the best Españols that were sent here as governor generals, even they, could not accept even some basic levels of reforms dito sa Pilipinas because they feared na any move towards even minimum reforms, liberal reforms, would mean the end of the Spanish Empire as we know it, which really eventually comes with the Treaty of Paris, right? 2 decades later. But by 1870s, hindi gusto mangyari ng Espanya yan. So they were pushing back against that very strong. So this is a very important part of the movie because here it shows that what Rizal represented when he advocated for liberal values of equality, freedom of expression, etc., things that today we consider as standard, whatever, dilawan even, these were radical, these were revolutionary, these were treasonous, and therefore, kaya nga na execute si Rizal, right? And this brings us to level 3 because the third part of this movie, ang dami natin mga logistical problems kaya, tapos may mga ingay pa dito, etc. Sorry about that, guys. Naging lecture tuloy yan kaysa magandang tuloy-tuloy na vlog. Pero I'll try to make na lang some vlogs about this na medyo maayos-ayos para ma-appreciate ko na maganda. Pasensya na, I'll try to make this better. Okay, let's talk about the third part. Now, dun sa pelikulang Gumburza, makikita niyo si Pasiano, right? Yung kuya ni Rizal, right? And dun sa pelikula, makikita mo na si Pasiano will make sure that his brother will, in a way, be exposed dun sa reality, to the truth, and also in a way to continue. Now, sino nag-akala na itong maliit na bata na makikita mo sa movie ay, my goodness, ay magiging Jose